everybody. Welcome back to Toasted the Podcast. This is episode 2. I'm Margie Wright, and
I'm Nick Farnoli.
And we are your hosts for Toasted. As you know, we are just two everyday people figuring out life clearly. And we are just so excited to have had the response to episode 1. And I think that that's how we're going to start out. It's just a whole bunch of thank yous because they are more than deserved. So Nick, I'm going to toss it over to you and you can start.
Yeah, like Margie said, just the outpouring of response to the first Toasted podcast was remarkable and extremely inspiring as the person sitting behind the microphone, because it really gave Margie and I the push that we needed, I think, to put together more episodes. And I know that I can't speak for Margie, but I have all like this sort of explosion of ideas about, things to talk about and people to interview. And also I wanted to just say thank you to everyone who reached out and who also responded when I was like, hey, I'm glad you like the podcast. You should be on the podcast as a guest. And today, only one person said they wouldn't, but I think they probably would if I pushed hard enough. So I think that's been really cool. And it speaks to the sort of universal application of what we're talking about here. I think everybody sort of recognizes that failure is what we go through in life more often than we care to admit. And this is a place where we want to have a dialogue with you and with each other about that. I do want to add that our first episode had over 100 to date in 2 days or 3 days, maybe over 100 downloads in 5 countries, which is pretty cool to me. Yeah. And so you can access the podcast now on iHeartRadio. If you use that platform, you can access it on Spotify, and I'm hoping to be on Apple Podcasts as well, but there's a little bit of a vetting process that they put you through. So as soon as we know that, I'll let you know. We also are streaming our podcasts on YouTube. So, even there, we've had 50 views on YouTube, which is great because people could look at Margie's hair, which I know was a very big... I can only speak from personal experience. My mother was very interested in seeing your hair after listening to the podcast. So Margie's hair has become a character on the show, and so that's great. But yeah, if you want to access that, I'll put the link to the YouTube channel in the show notes, as well as anything else we talk about in the show. I'll try and drop in the show notes.
So thank you.
But yeah, thank you very much. It's been awesome.
Yeah. It's been awesome. And, Nick does all the editing. So thank you for taking that role on with this. And today is Sunday. It is Sunday morning, actually, when we're recording this. So go Bills. Bills Steelers today at 1:00. So it is game day hair, game day, fun, going over to Kelly's parents' house to watch the Bills' first half of the game with Brad, Yolanda, Markham, love you. And Kelly and her younger daughter, Lexi, are here visiting. And so we'll be doing that. Then heading up to the Good School Farm for Farm Fest for the second half, where we will be having a whole lot of fun. And Margie gets to play bartender. So that will be a grand time. So I'm excited about that. And but it's just going back to the thank yous. The responses were so humbling, so overwhelming, grateful, and what people took away brought, like Nick said, like our ideas are just exploding, like the applicability in certain areas we hadn't even considered. And then, people sharing ideas, people sharing things they'd like to hear about, and which is the feedback we desire. So please keep it coming. And just the kindness and compassion and love that was just given so freely in response to this. I mean, I, posted on my personal Facebook, just this is the biggest risk I've ever taken. And as I started to write that, I realized I was going to say to date, this is the biggest risk to date. And I think that that's a piece of coming through something like this, is trying new things and pushing yourself and daring yourself and all of that. And, going back this morning when I woke up and I was just kind of looking, I try to post a quote every day on our Toasted Facebook page and our Toasted Instagram page. So if you haven't checked those out, please do. And when I went to do that, it shows, the pop-up, and it said, 2 years ago today. And it was one of my many hikes in Naples in the woods that I took, because it was a time where I was in between, when I didn't know what was going on. And it was my contemplation place. And I thought, I'm looking at these pictures going, oh my gosh. And it dawned on me. I remember texting Kelly, and I remember texting you, because you were like, how are you today? And I was like, well, I'm climbing up a dry waterfall in Naples. And you're like, what? Why are you alone? Like, what are you doing? You're terrifying me. And I'm like, this is kind of my life right now. And, and then I think, and so now I'm looking at this, and I'm like, just thinking, oh my gosh, 2 years forward, who could have known where things would be, especially at that moment, which is the whole point of this podcast. And then, all of a sudden I got a text from you that said, we had 100. And it was just like, this is the most amazing dichotomy of feelings ever. So that was, I'm like, I definitely need more coffee. And just so grateful. So thank you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah. And I think, just to sort of jump in on what you said there really quickly, I think one of the important takeaways is just to remember, if you're if you're somebody who's in the middle right now of just feeling like your life sucks, like we've both been there.
And there.
We've been deep in the my life sucks. And it's really, really hard. And that's the first thing I would tell you is like, it'd be okay with that. It's hard, but it's okay that it's hard right now. And it won't be like that forever, which was super annoying to me when people would say that.
Yep.
But it's so true. And you don't know what will happen on the other side. And I think that's the piece that I've come to appreciate, having come through some pretty significant, call them failures, I guess, but they are, whether I look at them this way now, I didn't look at them like that originally, right now I look at them and I wonder if they were failures or just stepstones to something else. But in that moment, they were definitely failures. But
yeah, it's, when I think, we have to define failure. And I think failure each person has a different definition, and maybe it's situational. I'm not sure. I was thinking a lot about this, and that was actually a piece of feedback I got, was that like, well, what do you mean when you say failure? What do you mean with success? Like, define that for whatever the subject is of the podcast. I thought, well, that was very good feedback. Thank you for that. And that was my daughter-in-law, Nicole. So thank you, Nicole. And I thought, is there a universal definition? Is failure just not meeting the expectation that you not just were seeking, but that everything pointed to? So I don't know. I was trying to think of something, but so Nick, since you are the subject of today's podcast, what would you say is failure?
Well, I think it doesn't really matter what the definition is. It's more of that feeling that you don't understand or like where your life is at a particular moment, right? How you define it really doesn't matter. It's just the experience of it that I think is important, right? Because look, if you go to the store, and I've done this 100 times, probably 3 times last week, you go to the store and you get your groceries, and then you leave and you're driving home and you're like, I forgot butter. Yep. That can feel like a failure because like, why can't I just remember the simple things? Why don't I just make a list? And so I think that I know I'm better about lists than I used to be, but like that moment feels like a failure, but it's 90% me making it a failure. And that actually, to me, is the definition of failure. It's whatever subjective talk you're putting yourself through.
That's excellent.
Now that's a little thing, and it's easy to kind of work through like, okay, I forgot the butter. That's not a big deal.
But it's those self-criticism voices in your head. It's that
and that is
in your head.
Yeah, I think that's the failure. So I actually posed this very same question to one of my classes. Not yesterday. Yeah, yesterday, Friday. No, today's Sunday. So Friday. And we talked about failure and the nature of failure. And they had a really interesting perspective, which was anytime you give up, that's a failure.
Ooh.
And so I know that really challenged my thinking around failure. That's really interesting. So that, I think I don't get too hung up. And someone, in their feedback to me said, well, what is that? What is the failure? Because, you have this whole premise, but I think that's kind of the point, is that like the reason it's universal is because we all create our own failures by internally putting pressures on ourselves or expectations on ourselves, or even just beating ourselves up. Like that's the failure. Yeah. So and I don't know if that's a textbook definition.
Well, luckily this isn't a textbook, it's a podcast. So I guess we get to have it and we get to own it.
Right.
And, I think too that there's a difference between the dialogue in your head, be it about forgetting a grocery item or something bigger. And then there's the public. There's those times when you have no choice but to, everybody sees it, so to speak. And I think that is a different layer and a different aspect of it. And we'll explore that certainly on the show. So I love that it's really, truly multidimensional, that we get to kind of take this premise. And when we have, our guests on here, to ask them where they're coming from, because that definitely helps us understand then where this conversation is going and the different parts that will come, within the podcast itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Nick.
Yeah.
So what are we going to be toasting at the end with? Let's start with that. We started last time talking about tequila. What is your choice today? We'll start with that. I mean, we're both sipping coffee right now.
Yeah. Well, we are sipping coffee, although I think my coffee might be different than yours. So my favorite of all-time drink is a Negroni, which is made with gin, red vermouth, and Campari. But it seemed to me that at 9:00 in the morning, that wasn't really a great plan. So I elected for my second favorite cocktail, or I don't know if it counts as a cocktail actually, but just Irish coffee, a little Jameson, a little Bailey's. I like a little Bailey's in there. And so that's what I'm drinking today out of my mug. Shout out to my good friend, Kristen Dyer, former colleague and now physician's assistant somewhere. I actually don't know. And so Kristen, forgive me, but I do recognize that she gave me this cup because I would always say, she'd say, how you doing? I was like, meh. So she got me a cup. So cheers to Kristen.
Cheers.
And yeah, good people. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, this is my morning coffee mug, my Wonder Woman mug. And I got this for me when I completed my first admin course back in 2013. And I was at Barnes & Noble, which is where I love to go because of the distractions are gone and I have to focus on my work. And I went down to refill my Starbucks and this was there. And I have been a lifelong Wonder Woman fan. And at the time, it's not that big of a saying anymore, but everybody's like, what's your why? Know your why. Do you ever know what's your why? And so I thought, okay, why am I putting myself, through all this and everything? And as soon as I saw the Wonder Woman mug, I was like, oh, there it is. Like I've been a lifelong Wonder Woman fan, and every superhero has, their creed that they live by. And hers is, I defend those who cannot defend themselves. And I thought, as a teacher, as an administrator, as somebody, we are a public school. Nick and I, we met being principals, so it's a public school. Every child is welcome there. Every child should feel welcome there. Every child belongs there, and not every child has advocates who can be there for them for whatever reason. And so, to me, like that focused me on remembering during the hard times, the criticism times, things like that. So I drink every single morning out of my Wonder Woman mugs, and that's why. Nice. I'm a Tullamore Dew girl when it comes to Irish whiskey. That's my favorite, is Tullamore Dew.
Well, we won't fault you for that.
Why?
I mean, Jameson's the clear winner, just for the record. But
see, this is the fun stuff that you guys get to weigh in on. So Jameson's or Tullamore Dew? First challenge: Jameson or Tullamore Dew? We'll go there. We'll see which Irish whiskey.
All right, you can put your response. You can put your response if you're watching this on YouTube. You can put your response in the chat below or in the comments below, because I have a feeling I'm going to win this one. So. And also, by the way, in YouTube, if you do watch this on YouTube, if you want to subscribe or like the podcast, that's very helpful as well.
Thank you. So,
all right,
get to it, Nick.
Okay, we got the banter out of the way there,
Yeah.
Margie, right? So,
So
um, I am the subject of this interview.
yeah, we decided that,
Okay.
and
Yep.
yep, we did. Last
Hmm.
podcast, I said that this one would be me interviewing you or our conversation.
Yeah.
So we've already discussed the definition of failure. We've discussed what we're cheering with, and so now tell us, what aspect is it that you want to explore on this particular podcast? Is it more global? Is it more specific? It's up to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think last time we talked a little bit about acquiring a taste for failure, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of a life's work, I think. And that's one thing to
Oh,
say. Like, I had a student um, who listened to the podcast, a former student who listened to the podcast. Actually, I have to say she's probably one of my favorite students of all time. You're not supposed to have those, but I
no,
mean, who
you
doesn't?
do.
Really? So,
Yeah, you do. We're human.
um, so the student reached out and was like, I love the analogy of acquiring, and oddly enough, she's going through something pretty tough in her life too. And she said, I just really like the idea of acquiring it because it's not a quick process, right? So it's not like you wake up one day and you're like, failure, I got it, right? It's more like you wake up one day, you're like, failure, ugh. And then the next day you're kind of like, okay, I can do this. And then the day after that, you're like, I can't do this, right? And it's very much a roller coaster and very much a process. Yeah.
Very much. And
So
then
we kind of hit on that last time, but yeah.
there's the pre-failure stage, the part where you are hanging on harder than you've ever thought you could hang on in your life, because of that fear of failure, and you can't let go because you can't see beyond this very moment. And then whether you let go or somebody pulls your fingers off or cuts the rope off, whatever way it happens to go down,
Yeah.
there you are in it. And then you sit there and go, how is this my life? And what in God's name do I do? And then you start to acquire a taste for it because you never had to before.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the healthier way to do it. I think some people just resist it.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
And I understand why.
yeah. I mean, I think we all do it first. It's horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
But I do think at some point, well, so this kind of gets into my story a little bit, but at some point you have to start acknowledging it, which I couldn't have done had I not also kind of developed a meditation practice. And I don't get too hung up on like what the definition of that practice is. Like sometimes it was as simple as going for a walk or a run. Sometimes it was, they talk about like being on the cushion, on the pillow and like actually doing the meditation. But also I and Margie referenced this last time, and I'll put a link to this in the show notes because it was very helpful. A book called The Artist's Way. And for me, what The Artist's Way was it was kind of like a textbook for how to deal with life, right? And I don't know that the author necessarily meant it that way, but the central premise is that you write 3 pages every day, no matter what. You wake up and you write 3 pages, and so I did that for 2.5 years. I wrote 3 pages every day.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Now I won't lie that my second journal was substantially smaller than my first journal. So the journal that you get with the workbook is like, a big, it's like bigger than a normal notebook. It's already 3 pages, and that was pretty difficult. But all sorts of interesting things happened. Number one, I realized that I'm just not that interesting, which sounds,
did not
it sounds self-deprecating, but it was a really important moment to like realize like, okay, I'm just not that interesting, and that's okay, right? Like that realization is okay.
I just can't even.
And so
laughing so hard.
Well, it's true, and that was a really important moment for me. Yeah, but the thing is, like, but think about the implication there for failure, right? Failure means that you've let someone or something down. But if you're just not that interesting, or you could substitute in that important, like it's not you're not the center of the world. And I think that to me really freed me up. It's like, oh yeah, okay, I can kind of exist in this world as an imperfect human being because none of us are really that important. And to be honest with you, if Elon Musk did the same thing, he would have the exact same realization. Because if you write 3 pages every day, sooner or later you realize you're not that interesting, right? Because like you're
learn
like,
a lot.
today, yeah, today I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to buy carrots. It's like, great, you know, but that's a real life thing. So that happened. The flip side of that is it also got some of the garbage out. So writing three hours a day, or not 3 hours, 3 pages a day. Sometimes it took 3 hours. I'm not going to lie. You get the garbage out, like the I don't understand my life. You can only write that so many times before you realize, like, yeah, you're right. You can't understand your life because your life isn't understandable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not you. It's the way the world works. You're not supposed to know everything. If you knew everything, there'd be no point in living it, right? It'd be like, you ever, there's very few movies you can watch a second time and be interested.
Really?
You kind of know the plot. Well, I mean, maybe you're interested, but it's not. You don't have that sort of novel experience of it, right?
Okay.
There's very few movies I think that you can watch a second time and have a novel experience. Maybe that's the way.
Yeah, I
because
agree.
You're right. A good movie is entertaining multiple times. Okay, so and that's all. I mean, it's kind of the same thing with your life. Like you're not really you're not supposed to know everything because otherwise it wouldn't be that interesting.
Well, I think
these
all
are
of us.
Working theses.
Yeah, this whole thing is a work in progress, people. I think that,
Mm-hmm.
all of us have come across people who, I don't want to say do think they know everything because that sounds mean, but, who think they know everything. And I just think that just shows a closed mindset and, an absolute that doesn't exist. I personally think there are very few things that I can say. I remember going through like social research and what that means and blah, blah, blah. There's the big T truth. And then there's the little T truth. And I remember that like blew my mind. I was like, what? And the big T truths are those ironclad absolutes. And I think there are very few things in life that hold that. I don't think there's nothing. I think there are very few things, but I think the more you rack up the big T truths, the more you're closed off to experiencing, exploring, and learning all the various things the little T truths do. Because the little T's are the stones on the path, and you just keep going forward to new experiences and new, I never considered this, and things of that nature.
Yeah.
But
Well, and that gets to that earlier question about like how do you define failure, and you can't because it changes. A failure for me right now is much different than a failure was for me 5 years ago. I would define it completely different.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember, the failure for me. I remember my kids were in high school, and my son didn't get the score he wanted on a Regents exam, and I was like, "Well, sweetie, like I failed my geometry, Regents," and I remember the look on his face. He's like, "You failed something," and it still created like even just saying it to my kid, like, is my kid gonna think less of me, and just the opposite made me more human, and I was like, oh, like it was epic fail. And I remember, like thinking, will I ever get out of high school? Will I fail everything now? And only to come to find out that you just need algebra for your Regents requirement. And I was like, oh, okay. But it became like this dirty little secret, so that at graduation, when I graduated, at the time it was, Regents with distinction or some nonsense. And I remember thinking, like, I hope nobody finds out I failed my geometry Regents, because what if they strip me of this title? It's like, what the heck? It's just, it doesn't matter. But at the time, that was epic. I'd never failed a test before, let alone a Regents exam. So it was exactly what needed to happen.
Yeah. And I think to kind of piggyback on that, I'll tell you a story that's even more ludicrous to me now as I look at it. Like, and my parents tell this story frequently. I'm one of 6 kids, and I would say my older 3 siblings, although all extremely intelligent, were not academic. And for some reason I was like, I mean, I wasn't a top student, but I was like, I was a good student. I was good at school, actually.
That's it right there. I was good at school.
And
Yep.
I loved, yeah, yeah. And I loved math, actually. Oddly enough, I didn't love English in high school. But I did love math. And
Never knew that. Really? Ugh.
yeah, well, I'll tell you two stories. The
Good.
first one, though, is that I came home one day and I was very upset about how horribly I had done on this test, and kind of like, did the middle school sulk, ran upstairs, laid on my bed, pouted. Came to dinner time and my mother walked in and she said, "Well, are you coming down for dinner?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll be down." She's like, "What's wrong?" And I was like, "Oh, I didn't do very well on the test." She's like, "Oh, well, that happens, don't beat yourself up." Did the very motherly thing. So we get down to dinner and we're all eating, and my father asked me what was wrong, and I did "Oh, I didn't do very well on the test." He said, "Well, what'd you get on this test?" And I was like, "I got a 92." And he put his fork down and he looked at me and he goes, "What?" I was like, "I got a 92." And he goes, "What?"
Yep.
And I said, "I should have gotten 100. I knew all the answers. I knew how to do them, but I got a 92." And he was like, "Nick, you are ridiculous," right? So like for me, and this is a silly example again.
No, it's
I
not.
look at it now and I kind of laugh because that it was such a failure to my middle school
Mm-hmm.
mind.
Mm-hmm.
Such a failure. And
Oh no,
the
I think that's
absurdity
one of the
of
reasons
it.
why we relate to each other and why we are friends is because we have so many similarities that we never even realized. Like, first of all, I didn't even know you grew up in Greece, or your mom, or your earlier years, in your
My
mom's
mom
family. I was
did.
like, wait, yeah,
Yeah.
I was like, wait, what? Like that's craziness. But no, I remember, same type of thing. I got a 98 on something, and like they had to call the school
Yeah.
counselor because my head was down on my desk and I was crying and I refused to go to lunch. I just was sitting there. I was that little kid with like the head on the desk, just like the tears coming, and they're
That's
like,
really funny.
"What happened to her?" And I was just like,
Yeah.
"I'm awful." Yeah, I've come a long way.
Right. And so like when you think about all right, so you think about that, and then you
Mm-hmm.
think about like where your life eventually ended up. Sorry, not ended. That's a very different. That's a very different podcast. You have to go somewhere else for that one.
I
Um,
spit out my coffee.
so sorry, but I think like that gets to that sort of subjectivity of failure, right? Like in my middle school mind, that was a failure. Now flash forward, right? So like at the end of high school, this is the second story. I was given basically a full ride to RIT for mechanical engineering, which is hilarious
That's awesome.
because I am not. Yeah, well, my mother was like, super excited. Although I have to tell you this story. She said, "You're really good at math and science, and you should be an engineer." And I was like, "I love trains. That's a great idea." So like I applied thinking like I didn't really know what an engineer was. That's kind of funny, but
I love
I
that.
really, after I figured out what an engineer was, I'm sorry, and in all truthfulness, I eventually figured it out, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that does sound kind of interesting," and I want to do green research. And I went to my school counselor and I said, "I want to do green research," and she said, "There's no future in that. Go get your mechanical engineering degree. You work for a company and whatever." And I was like, "Absolutely not. I'm not doing that." And I didn't take the scholarship. I turned down a
That's
full
big.
ride to RIT, never went for a day, and weirdly, that never felt like a failure, right? So this like 92 on a
Mm-hmm.
test felt like a failure, but leaving a full ride never felt like I failed. Although, um, there were certainly days when I looked at my financial situation, having enormous student loan debt, but that's a separate discussion. I think,
For for people who don't know, RIT
yeah,
is
go ahead.
Rochester Institute. RIT is Rochester
Oh,
Institute of Technology. So for people who aren't familiar with that, and it's a very highly regarded institution. So that is a big deal. It is definitely a big deal. But you hit, I think, on a central theme, which is failure is to the person. Like that wasn't a failure.
yeah,
It just was not. This is not where I want my life to go, and I'm not going to go in that direction. And some people applaud and say that's very brave. So again, it's based on the person, and that set of internal dialogue expectation.
So in some ways, that's very liberating to think about, right? I think because how you're thinking about your experiences is actually what dictates whether or not it's a failure. So, and then, and sometimes that changes over time. So like, Margie and I have talked about this several times, I guess, but, going through a divorce, which both of us have, at times felt like the biggest failure ever. And at other times I've looked at it and I thought, my God, like, not that I wanted that to be my existence, but like when I look at like what that's meant and how I've reshaped my life and rethought about my life, it's not a failure. And I think that's kind of the idea is like, so we create our own reality in some ways, and how we think about our life dictates our emotional response to it. Mm-hmm. And I'm watching the time here, Margie, and I can't believe we're almost out of time on this podcast. So I do want to kind of put a fine point on it and just tell everyone that like the subjectivity of what we're talking about here should feel, I think, ultimately liberating, because you get to decide what a failure is and how you react to it. And I think that is the takeaway I would leave folks with today.
I think it's a huge
what do you think,
takeaway.
Margie?
I agree, because it comes down to controlling the narrative and realizing that you control the narrative of your life. You control the narrative of the experiences. You control it. And it took me a long time to come to that. I don't want to say realization, but that understanding of it. And I know we said this in episode 1, but when you're through it, if you will, you can reflect and look back. At the time, it's you know, all those things are, like you said earlier, I mean, they're annoying when people will say, like, oh, it'll all work out. You're like, really? How is this all going to work out? Could you please tell me how this will work out? And so when you realize like you control the narrative, and whether it's divorce or anything else, I mean, it doesn't make all of it beautiful and perfect or any of those things. But that's, it's messy. Life is messy. And there you have it.
But I think, one other thing that you touched on that's important to say too, is that failure is really an absence of control. And that's what scares most people, I think, right? Is that absence of control. And so if you're reframing it and thinking about it as your own thing to decide on, then you actually have already regained control. When you get to decide if what's happened is a failure, then you've regained control. Now, that's easier said than done, for sure.
It is, but that's
definitely something that I think is important.
Huge. It's everything, because every step forward is a victory. Every step forward. I remember in the darkest hours of this, darkest days of this, telling myself, like I challenged myself, you have to do 3 things. It didn't matter how small they were, but you had to do 3 things. And I remember it felt like Herculean tasks. And I would say, make your bed. And like, I would have to to get up and make my bed and then sit back down. It was exhausting. And I'm like, okay, 1, you did 1 thing. Next. And even if I did 3 things by 11 a.m. and that was it, and I just sat in my chair staring out the window at the 16th green on the golf course for the rest of the day, that didn't matter. I did 3 things. And it's about regaining control, and it's that perception that we're supposed to have this total control, and that's not it either. So there's a happy medium there somewhere that I think that in life you're still exploring or trying to figure out. But so it's definitely about that. Yeah.
All right, folks.
Episode 3 is going to be more of your story. Is that what we're doing? Because we really didn't get to much of it. So is episode 3
that's
more
true.
of your story?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yay!
Yeah. And I think I don't know if we mentioned this already, but we're hoping to drop episodes every Thursday.
Oh, that's right. We're going to say that.
Yeah. Well, now we did. So episodes will drop every Thursday. So,
Our goal is weekly.
Yeah. We're hoping to put out about yeah, to do for a month. So
Hmm.
we'll see if we can keep that up.
Yeah, we will.
All right. Well, this is the fun part.
Yeah. Cheers, Nick.
Yeah.
Cheers to
Cheers,
all of you.
Margie. And thank you to everyone. Yeah. Thanks to everyone for listening. All right. We'll see you next week.
Bye.